So continuing our discussion on Darkseid War, where the first video was a little slow in that the story was largely built up, from this point going forward, things will actually pick up pretty fast. In the last video, we had talked about how Lex Luthor's sister had turned on both himself and Superman, shooting Lex in the process and teleporting both men to Apokolips, the planet of Darkseid. Picking up with the continuation of this, where some of you had asked how a simple bullet was able to pierce the armor of Lex, which is designed to withstand blows from Superman, Johns tells us that the bullet was composed of a metal Lex doesn't recognize. Now this is kind of an offhanded dismissal of the circumstance, but what I want to do here is I want to talk for a few moments about the armor of Lex Luthor, since this is actually going to be something that makes several appearances in this story. While the Warsuit's appearance in DC Comics dates back to Action Comics number 544 in 1983, within the New 52, this is the third iteration of Lex's design. The first was actually a giant robot which was controlled by Lex Luthor and first showed up in Action Comics number 17. The second was a smaller but bulkier suit that appeared in Action Comics issue number 20, leading to the current suit, which appeared in Forever Evil. Now this version is connected to LexCorp using its computers and can actually tap into various satellites, allowing Lex Luthor to access other intelligence agencies' information from around the world. In addition to this, it's capable of energy and electric blasts, is powered by solar energy, can create force fields, as well as various other abilities that appear within the context of various stories. As an example, in issue number 43 of Justice League in this story, we'll actually find out that the suit has a medical system built into it. However, at the moment, Superman uses his heat vision to cauterize the wounds of Lex Luthor after he was shot. Now this is actually a pretty big moment for Superman, and the reason why is because this signifies the attempt of Clark to bridge the gap between himself and Lex. What I mean here is that, like our discussion in the last video, Superman and Lex have consistently been enemies. Because Forever Evil saw Lex Luthor bringing together the world's villains to save the world, Superman had to put those issues aside after recognizing the value in what Lex brings to the table regarding his intelligence and resources. However, Johns also leaves us to determine the other half of this equation, and that because both Superman and Lex are on Apokolips, we can make a legitimate argument that Clark will need the help of Lex to make their way through the landscape and find a way back. From here, we jump to Darkseid himself. Now this particular section of the comic will give us some very valuable insight into his character, as well as how his servants relate to him. As the ruler of Apokolips, Darkseid is met with the arrival of Darkseid and Steppenwolf, who inform him that Superman has arrived on the planet. To sidetrack for a second, in the pre-New 52 continuity, Darkseid was a new god on New Genesis who had turned against Highfather and joined Darkseid after being corrupted. But because the line-wide reboot of New 52 changed the history of Darkseid but provides no history for Darkseid, at this point we can either assume that his history is either unknown or that the history from before the New 52 remains the same. However, considering that Johns is rewriting the entire story of the New Gods under the New 52, it stands to reason that we simply just don't know the backstory of Darkseid. Now regarding Steppenwolf, in the pre-New 52 continuity, his character made his debut as the uncle of Darkseid and eventually rose to become his top general. But again, in the New 52, like Darkseid, we don't know the story of Steppenwolf or how it was that he came to be one of Darkseid's top two men. Now where the idea of Steppenwolf is that he will kill Superman using his axe, what Johns tells us is that Steppenwolf does not know the measure of Superman's powers. Where Steppenwolf has been able to kill other new gods, Darkseid makes the case that Superman isn't the same. What Johns means here is that the power of Superman is derived from his Kryptonian physiology, and in many ways, Superman is way beyond the power of the new gods, with the exception of Darkseid himself and presumably Highfather. However, the strength variance between Darkseid and Superman changes based on the writer, and where Jeff Loeb and Paul Jenkins would give us stories where Superman was stronger, within the New 52 Justice League and the Darkseid War, Darkseid himself is stronger than Superman. This combined with the fact that Darkseid orders the slaves to be released from the pens even though none of them could defeat the Man of Steel tells us that the goal of Darkseid is not to kill Superman and instead is to simply keep him preoccupied. What we also learn here is that Darkseid and his group are aware of the fact that Anti-Monitor is on Earth and making preparations for war against Darkseid himself. Now where this is Johns laying the foundation here for what will come later, I want to take this time to answer the question of how Darkseid fits into the conflict as we've seen it so far. Where Darkseid does not answer Steppenwolf's question of what they're fighting for, in terms of everything up to this point, all we really know is that in relation to Darkseid, Anti-Monitor is a former new god named Mobius who had committed an unknown act in the past. Intending to make up for it, Anti-Monitor allied himself with Grail, the daughter of Darkseid, for the purpose of killing Darkseid himself. Now, transitioning away from this scene and to Scott-Free, some of you would also express some confusion as to who Marina Black is and how Grail fits into the continuity aside from being an ally of Anti-Monitor. In the last video, we had talked about how Marina Black was the top assassin of Themyscira and the mother of Grail. Where the motives behind this were unclear in the first issue, in this section we learn that this was done as fulfillment of Marina Black's perception of the role of Amazons. What I mean here is that according to Maria, the Amazonians were given their power for the purpose of working as shepherds, protecting the world from war. Where Marina viewed the life of Amazonians' isolation as the group effectively walking away from their mission, if she were to attempt insurrection in an effort to return to the status quo, she would likely have been exiled or executed. However, because she intended to maintain the original mission of the Amazons despite her knowledge of Darkseid and the fact that he would one day invade and enslave the Earth, she procreated with him for the purpose of creating a child whose power could rival both that of the New Gods and the Amazonians themselves. And so after giving birth to Grail and abandoning Themyscira, Marina began training her daughter in the ways of combat and instilling in her the desire to destroy Darkseid. Now, the extreme view of Marina comes into play when she makes the case that a fight between Darkseid and the Anti-Monitor on Earth will result in a high amount of casualties, but for Marina, ending the reign of Darkseid is more important than the lives of those who will die. Now, this doesn't mean that Marina does not value life. Instead, this is simply a classic utilitarian argument. What I mean here is that in the realm of moral philosophy, the argument of utilitarianism makes the case that the needs of the many are more important than the needs of the few. Because Darkseid and Highfather rule their respective lands outside of the multiverse, with Darkseid able to make conquest against the inhabitants of any universe in existence, the lives of a few billion on Earth are completely irrelevant in comparison to the lives of countless others spread across the multiverse. However, because Scott's experience has made him aware of how powerful Darkseid is, and the fact that he may be immortal, for him, there's far too many what-ifs to sacrifice the lives of billions on a gamble. And so because this puts him at odds with Marina and his fighting skills are woefully limited in comparison to her own, Scott simply flees for his life before Marina can kill him. Now, jumping back to Earth with the arrival of the Anti-Monitor, the story continues the narrative of Wonder Woman from the previous issue as the events unfold. What she tells us is that in her experience, she's battled gods and powerful enemies from across the world and beyond. But where the motives of those beings were clear and that their hostilities were made prevalent immediately after their arrival, with the Anti-Monitor, she has no idea what he's looking for because he simply just stares at her battle with Grail. Now, the reason for this seems to be the vast power that Anti-Monitor possesses, but in the interest of keeping future events spoiler-free, I'm actually going to table this portion of the discussion for now. Instead, where some taunts are exchanged between Wonder Woman and Grail, this section of the story isn't wildly important except to provide us with the recognition of Grail's new god Amazonian hybrid physiology, and that it makes her superior to Wonder Woman in speed and strength. However, before she can intervene, the Anti-Monitor steps into the battle. Now, Wonder Woman's reaction here tells us that the heroes of Prime Earth in the New 52 have never met or heard of the Anti-Monitor, which is extremely important. The reason why is because what Geoff Johns is doing in this story is completely retconning the origin of the Anti-Monitor, his role within the DC universe and the multiverse, as well as how he gained his powers. But again, with the story speeding up in pace, this scene is met with the arrival of Metron, who simply appears for an instant, offers a couple words, and then teleports away with the heroes. Now, the conversation between Anti-Monitor and Grail, who have remained at the battle scene, reveals a couple of things and continues to fill in the holes. The first is that Grail seems to have waged a personal vendetta against the Justice League, but at the moment, we don't know why. The other is that the pact between Anti-Monitor and Grail is rooted in the fact that Grail promised to lure Darkseid out and bring him to the Anti-Monitor, allowing the two to engage in battle. Now, the next part of the story is extremely important because at this point, everything will begin to change in drastic ways. When Metron had appeared and teleported the heroes away, he had moved them and himself to a place called the Rock of Eternity. As a location that exists outside of the DC multiverse, the Rock of Eternity was formerly a base of operations for Shazam, the wizard who provided Billy Batson with his magical powers, but it also functions as a prison for the deadliest of magical beings, including the 7 demons representing the 7 deadly sins, who were the main foes during the Forever Evil lead-up event called Trinity War. In addition to this, the history between Hal Jordan and the New Gods comes into play with his animosity towards Metron. What I mean here is that in the last video we had discussed how the Green Lantern Godhead story saw Highfather leading a campaign to acquire the various Lantern battery cores in an effort to gain enough power to kill Darkseid. During the conflict, Metron had made his appearance to chronicle the events per his role, but for Hal, there seemed to be no differentiation between Metron and the other new gods. Now, where Wonder Woman intends to use her lasso as a way to gain the truth of Anti-Monitor's origin, why he intends to wage a war against Darkseid and how to stop him, the problem that they face is that Metron himself is not all-knowing. Instead, the accumulated knowledge of all things that he's seen and recorded reside within the Mobius chair. In response, Wonder Woman uses the lasso to force Metron to tell them the truth of how they can gain answers to their questions, which is revealed to be possible if they take the chair from him. Now, under normal circumstances, this would be virtually impossible due to the incredible power that Metron possesses as a new god. But because he's facing enemies whose power levels are quite likely on his own, this is not as difficult as it would normally be. This is coupled with the fact that, as we discussed in my Anti-Monitor video, the Anti-Monitor himself had previously created the chair for his own ends and handed it down to Metron. As such, there existed no information on what would happen if Metron were separated from the chair, but the answer is revealed when Wonder Woman pulls him away. When this happens, the chair prepares to teleport back to an unknown location, but before it does, Batman takes Metron's place on the chair. Now, in the comments section of the last video, some of you had asked me to clarify on what it was that happened to Batman once he took Metron's place. Because the chair holds knowledge of all things, the best way to think about this is that if knowledge is power, the knowledge of all things that have ever happened flow through its user. Now, one thing I want to make clear is that the Mobius chair does not provide answers to why people do the things they do. The Mobius chair simply just chronicles the actions of things that have happened. As an example, the Mobius chair does not chronicle why a man would walk into a bank and rob it. It simply just chronicles the fact that a man walked into a bank and robbed it. Now, in this case, within the context of this story, because Batman has sat on the chair, he now has knowledge of everything that has ever happened in the history of DC Comics, including the various crises DC has had over the course of their history and the reboots of their various universes. Putting this knowledge to the test, what Batman does is he tells us that he knows the identity of who killed his parents, and that unlike his speculation of the course involvement during Snyder's Court of the Owls story, that his parents truly died at the hands of Joe Chill. The other question Batman asks but never reveals here is the identity of the Joker. Now, where Batman's reaction tells us that he does know, what I would like you to do is keep this in the back of your head, because this question will serve as a major cliffhanger at the end of the first act of Darkseid War. And so as this portion of the story begins to come to an end, when the question is asked as to whether Batman is okay and has survived his experience, he simply replies by stating that he's now a god. With that being said, we're going to bring this video to an end, and again, if you guys have any questions, feel free to post them down in the comments section and I'll do my best to answer them. With that being said, I will catch you guys later. Peace.